Let me tell you something about the person who is a lot smarter than they let on. The one who plays confused in meetings when they have already calculated every implication of the decision being discussed. Who asks questions they already know the answers to. Who laughs along with jokes they find intellectually thin rather than say so. Who consistently underperforms relative to what they are actually capable of because performing at full capacity feels more dangerous than holding back. This is not a rare phenomenon. The psychology research finds it is extraordinarily common. Across genders, across cultures, across professional and social contexts. The deliberate concealment of intelligence and capability is one of the most consistent and least examined patterns in the social psychology of human behavior. And the reasons people do it, the specific psychological mechanisms that make playing dumb feel safer, more strategic, or more comfortable than genuine intellectual expression, are more interesting and more important than the behavior itself suggests. Because here's what the research finds. Acting dumb is almost never about being dumb. It is about a specific and often highly intelligent calculation about what genuine expression costs and what concealment provides. About the social dynamics of intelligence in environments that do not reliably reward it. About the psychological history of a person who learned somewhere along the way that being the smartest person in the room was not always the safest thing to be. That is what we are examining today. Let's start with the social psychology, because the external environment that produces this behavior is as important as the internal psychology of the person expressing it. The research on how intelligence is received in social environments is one of the most consistently uncomfortable bodies of work in the social psychology literature. Uncomfortable because what it finds challenges the assumption that intelligence is universally valued and universally rewarded. Leanne Young and colleagues at Boston College conducted research on the social perception of highly intelligent individuals in group settings. The findings document something that most highly intelligent people have already discovered experientially. Above a certain threshold of expressed intelligence, social reception becomes more complicated. The individual is perceived as less approachable, less warm, less likable. Not because they have done anything socially negative, but because the expression of significantly superior cognitive capacity in a group setting activates specific social dynamics that the research has been mapping for decades. The backlash against expressed intelligence is not uniform. It is context-dependent. It is moderated by gender, by cultural environment, by the specific social hierarchy of the group. But across multiple studies and multiple contexts, the research finds a consistent pattern. Expressed intelligence creates social distance. And social distance for a social species whose psychological well-being is deeply dependent on belonging is experienced as a genuine threat. The person who acts dumb in social contexts is often making, at some level of conscious or unconscious calculation, a rational response to this dynamic. Trading cognitive authenticity for social belonging, accepting the cost of concealment in order to avoid the cost of exclusion. Here is the research that explains why this behavior is so much more common in some populations than others. The phenomenon of strategic self-presentation, the deliberate management of how one's capabilities and characteristics are perceived by others, is one of the most extensively studied areas in social psychology. Irving Goffman's foundational dramaturgical framework, the idea that social life involves continuous performance management, that people are always to some degree managing the impression they make, provides the conceptual foundation. But the specific version of strategic self-presentation that involves the downward management of expressed intelligence has a specific and important pattern in the research. It is significantly more common in women than in men in mixed gender social and professional contexts. Laurie Rudman and Julie Phelan's research on gender and intellectual self-presentation documented the specific social penalties that women face for expressing intellectual superiority in mixed gender settings. The research found that women who expressed high intellectual confidence and demonstrated superior performance were rated as less socially attractive and less desirable as partners or colleagues than men who expressed the same level of confidence and performance. The research on the social expectations embedded in gender norms and the specific expectation of female modesty and communal orientation versus male assertiveness and agentic orientation is directly relevant. Women who violate these expectations by expressing intellectual dominance face what the research calls backlash, social penalties for nonconformity with the expected gender performance. The woman who acts dumb in the presence of men she is intellectually superior to is not doing so because she lacks confidence in any simple sense. She is navigating a social environment that has delivered consistent and specific feedback about what happens when she does not. Now, let me talk about the developmental origins, because the psychology of acting dumb is almost always rooted in something that happened earlier than the current social context. The research on the socialization of gifted children and the clinical literature on what happens psychologically to children who are significantly more intellectually advanced than their peers is directly relevant here. The gifted child in an ordinary classroom environment faces a specific social challenge. Their natural cognitive pace and natural intellectual interest are out of step with the environment around them, and the social feedback they receive for expressing that genuine cognitive level is often negative. Alienation from peers. The label of know-it-all, the social exclusion that comes from being too different, too advanced, too other. Maraka Gross's longitudinal research on highly gifted children found a consistent pattern. Children who experienced significant negative social feedback for their intellectual expression developed specific adaptive strategies. The most common was what she called voluntary underachievement, the deliberate suppression of cognitive expression to a level that the social environment could accommodate, the concealment of capability in service of belonging. This adaptation, developed in childhood in response to genuine social consequences, does not simply switch off when the child becomes an adult. It becomes part of the operating system, a default strategy that activates automatically in social situations that feel similar to the ones where the original learning happened. The adult who acts dumb in professional or social settings is very often running a program they developed at 10 years old in a classroom that could not accommodate who they actually were. Here is the piece that the research identifies as most important for understanding the full picture. Acting dumb is not always defensive. Sometimes it is strategic in a more proactive sense. The research on political behavior in organizations and the social intelligence literature on how sophisticated social actors manage their presentation of self finds that deliberate underperformance and intelligence concealment can be genuinely strategic tools in specific contexts. The individual who plays dumb in a negotiation context, who allows the other party to underestimate their analytical capacity, has a specific and well-documented advantage. The research on asymmetric information in negotiation finds that the party whose capabilities are underestimated has more flexibility, more room to maneuver, and more ability to produce outcomes that favor them, while the other party believes they are operating in a balanced or advantageous position. The research on expectation management in performance contexts is also relevant. The individual who establishes a low baseline expectation and then over-delivers produces a significantly more positive impression than the individual who establishes a high baseline expectation and delivers exactly at that level. The same objective performance produces different social reception depending on where expectations were set. This is strategic use of intelligence concealment, not the defensive suppression of the child who learned that being smart was dangerous. The deliberate management of perception by someone who understands the psychology of expectation and is using that understanding intentionally. Let me talk about something the research identifies that cuts across both the defensive and the strategic versions of this behavior: the relationship between acting dumb and imposter syndrome. Pauline Clance and Suzanne Imes' foundational research on imposter phenomenon, the experience of believing that one's achievements are not genuinely deserved, that one has somehow deceived others about one's actual competence, and that eventual exposure as a fraud is inevitable, is directly relevant here. The person who acts dumb is sometimes doing so not from a calculated position of social or strategic intelligence, but from a genuine belief that their actual capability, if fully expressed, would be found wanting, that the intelligence they are concealing is not as impressive as it might appear. That full expression would reveal not superiority, but the specific inadequacy that imposter syndrome generates. This is the version of acting dumb that is most psychologically costly, because it is not a strategic choice. It is a defense against the exposure of a self-concept that is more fragile than the intelligence it is protecting would suggest. The research on imposter syndrome and intellectual self-presentation finds a paradoxical pattern. The individuals most likely to experience imposter syndrome are those with genuine high achievement and genuine high capability. The concealment is not protecting against the exposure of inadequacy. It is protecting against the specific terror of a self-concept that cannot believe its own genuine accomplishment. Here is the social dynamics research that is most practically important for understanding what acting dumb actually costs. The research on authenticity and long-term well-being, Michael Kernis and Brian Goldman's work on self-concept clarity and authentic functioning, finds that the sustained performance of a self that is significantly different from the genuine self carries consistent psychological costs. The cognitive load of maintaining a performance that conceals genuine capability is real. The continuous monitoring required of what has been expressed, what has been concealed, what the current audience can receive is attentionally expensive in ways that accumulate. The relational cost is significant. The person who consistently underexpresses their genuine intelligence in their close relationships cannot be genuinely known by those relationships. The connection they experience is connection with the performed version of themselves, not the genuine self that the concealment protects. And the identity cost, the gradual erosion of the relationship between how one presents and who one actually is the most psychologically significant of all. The research on authentic self-expression and identity stability finds that the gap between genuine self and presented self, sustained across time, produces a specific form of identity fragmentation. The person who has been acting dumb for long enough sometimes loses confident access to the genuine intelligence they were concealing. The performance and the reality begin to blur. Let me talk about the specific contexts where acting dumb is most common and what the research tells us about each. In romantic relationships, the research on partner intelligence dynamics and the social psychology of how intelligence differentials are navigated in intimate partnerships finds that the concealment of intelligence is more common in the early stages of relationship formation and in relationships where the power differential is significant. The partner who is significantly more intelligent and who has learned that full intellectual expression is socially costly brings that learning into intimate contexts. In professional environments, the research on organizational behavior and intellectual self-presentation finds that acting dumb is most common in hierarchical environments with low psychological safety. Amy Edmondson's research on psychological safety, the shared belief that the environment is safe for interpersonal risk-taking, is directly relevant. In environments where genuine intellectual contribution is not safe, where expressing a contradictory idea carries social or professional penalty, the concealment of genuine cognitive capacity is a rational, adaptive response. In social groups, the research on conformity and intellectual expression, extending Solomon Asch's foundational conformity research, finds that group pressure toward intellectual conformity is one of the most powerful and least examined forces in social psychology. The individual who holds a more sophisticated or more developed understanding of a situation than the group consensus frequently faces pressure, sometimes explicit, more often implicit, to conform to the group's cognitive level rather than express genuine divergence. Here is where I want to land. The psychology of people who act dumb is not a psychology of inadequacy. It is, almost universally, a psychology of sophisticated social calculation, conscious or unconscious, operating in environments that have delivered specific and often painful feedback about what genuine intellectual expression costs. The child who learned that being smart was socially dangerous. The woman who learned that intellectual superiority in the wrong context produced backlash. The professional who learned that expressing genuine capability threatened the people around them. The person whose imposter syndrome made full expression feel more like exposure than contribution. The strategist who understood that being underestimated was a genuine advantage. All of them are doing something that the research consistently finds is a rational response to the specific social environments and developmental histories they have navigated. The cost of that rational response is also real, the psychological cost of sustained concealment, the relational cost of connection that never reaches the genuine self. The identity cost of a performance maintained so long that the genuine self it was protecting becomes harder to access. The question the research ultimately asks, and that the person who acts dumb most needs to sit with, is not whether the concealment was rational. In the context that produced it, it often was. The question is whether the context has changed. Whether the environment you are concealing yourself in today is the environment that taught you concealment was necessary, or whether you are running a program developed for a world you no longer inhabit. On people who learned the hard way that being themselves was dangerous, and who deserve to find out whether that is still true.